and I will spotlight you so that you are the main screen for most people, for everybody. There we go. So welcome, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. So real quick before I start, I do have a cold, so bear with me if I start coughing or sneezing. I took medicine, so that shouldn't be a problem. And I also live with 3 other people, and I've told them, what I'm doing, so they shouldn't, be making any noise, but things happen in life. So if you hear something, don't panic. So I thought I'd start by explaining a little bit about how I got interested in this subject. So during my undergraduate years, I worked with a religious studies professor. Her name was Dr. Kelly Denton-Borhog. And I did 2 major research projects with her, focusing on US war culture and Christian theology. So I have a Christian background, so I do talk a lot about Christian themes and topics. And in short, the projects were about how Christian religious language, Christian theology, and Christian symbols have been used by American society to endorse war and violence. And then after I graduated from college, I studied at Bright Divinity School and worked as a graduate assistant at the Soul Repair Center, a think tank that researches moral injury and veterans. So that's how I really started to get really interested in this topic. But after Divinity School, I kind of decided, I'm going to focus a little bit on something else, like bigger picture issues. So at George Mason, I studied American foreign policy during the War on Terror. And then I went to Texas Christian University and researched the ways Western powers in the 1700s and 1800s used religion to justify violence and war. And I also focused on individual religious leaders who used their faith to push back against colonialism. And yes, I mentioned a lot of schools. So as you can understand, I have quite a bit of student debt, but I don't talk about that. But now I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I'm doing a year of service through Mercy Volunteer Corps. And I'm working on creating a certificate in peace promotion for my service site. And while doing research on the history and philosophy of nonviolence and nonviolent practices, I decided that during my free time, I would circle a little back to my original research interests during seminary on how war impacts those the government sends to fight in our behalf. So I've just begun, going back and dipping my toes back into this area of research. And I thought, this morning would be a good opportunity for me to talk through what I've kind of learned and relearned, and perhaps figure out, well, where should my research go next? So, hold on. Oh. Okay, so first I'll start with a basic overview of the background and evolving definition of moral injury. So it was first coined by psychiatrist Jonathan Shea in the 1990s while he was working with Vietnam veterans. He defined it as a betrayal of what's right by a person who holds legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. Since then, other definitions have sprung up, but they don't necessarily contradict this original definition. They expand and enhance it. So for instance, Cypress University's The Moral Injury Project defines moral injury as damage done to one's conscience or moral compass when that person perpetrates, witnesses, or fails to prevent acts that transgress one's own moral values, beliefs, or ethical codes of conduct. And journalist Diane Silver depicts it as a deep soul wound that pierces a person's identity, sense of morality, and relationship to society. So before I go on, to briefly describe how moral injury is different from post-traumatic stress disorder and give some examples of what moral injury looks like and what helps cause it, I want to make one quick note. So even though the term moral injury is fairly new, some scholars and practitioners have argued that, soldiers, people that have fought in wars have suffered from debating ethical dilemmas and have suffered from deep physical and spiritual wounds of war for centuries. So for instance, Dr. Harold G. Koenig and Dr. Fatan Al-Zabin argue that this concept goes back much further to at least ancient Greece. Of course, the term was different. So they point out that they point to the concept of Mia Masma. So sorry, my pronunciation is horrible, so I'm just gonna sound confident and just keep going. If I'm incorrect, you could just tell me. So they point to this concept as, So they point to the concept of miasma, or the idea of moral defilement or pollution. So this was often associated with unjust killings, but Al-Zaban and Koenig assert that the concept was also applied to any transgression that violated one's morals, and that this can impact, the perpetrators, the victims, and even people just witnessing what was going on. And here's an example from Ulysses and his work. What can I do? Where can I hide from all this and not be found? What wings would take me high enough? How deep a hole would I have to dig? My shame for the evil I have done consumes me. I am soaked in blood guilt, polluted, contagious. I am a pollutant and of offense to gods above. And then examples of what we now term moral injury can be found in the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and honestly, probably in any other massive conflicts that we have records of. So, hold on. So moral injury is a deep-seated anguish over what one has experienced, done, or witnessed. It caused them to question everything one thought was true about morality and goodness. Most of us take for granted the idea that we and our loved ones are, somewhat good. We know that no one is perfect, and we know that we and the people around us don't always act in ways that align with our morals. But I think many of us still have some sort of firm foundation. We know what's right and wrong, and we know that we try for the most part to do what, to live up to our ideals, and we hope and assume that the people around us more or less try to do that too. But moral injury destroys that firm foundation and leaves those suffering questioning their own goodness and the goodness of those around them. So when you are put in situations where you have been deeply betrayed by others in authority who are supposed to do the right thing, or when you yourself are placed into situations where you have to make split-second decisions that might violate your deepest moral values, it does make sense to question whether you or anyone else is good. But sometimes by violating your deepest values, or by being betrayed by those who violate your deepest values, it can feel like a shattering of the self and one's place in the world. It can lead to intense anger, shame, and a loss of identity. You aren't the person you thought you were, and the world isn't the place you thought it was. So Reverend Dr. Michael Yandell, who served in the Army from 2002 to 2006 and was deployed in Iraq for a 6-month stint in 2004 as a bomb disposal specialist, explains, and I'm quoting him, "Moral injury results in a kind of schism between one's perceived moral self and one's actions. When you recognize that you have failed to live by your own moral convictions, sort of a moral identity crisis." So as a country, when we send our service members to war, we're asking them to commit and witness acts that in any other circumstances would be viewed as unacceptable and morally wrong. By sending our service members to war, we're asking them to bear witness to the deaths of their friends and civilians. We're asking them to make split-second life and death choices. And, is this woman a terrorist or is she an innocent civilian? If we stop this convoy for a child, would that place my friends in danger, or should I win this child over? And if after that split-second decision, it turns out that the woman ends up not being a terrorist, or the child doesn't move out of the way, our response as a society tends to be, "Oh well, it wasn't your fault. That woman shouldn't have looked so threatening," or "that child should have gotten out of the way." And then we change the subject. So our country sends our service members into situations where the normal standards of morality do not kill, are thrown to the wayside, and then they're sent into situations where right and wrong isn't always clear. And when they return, we harp on war as being such a glorious good, and then we as a society quickly move on. And we expect our veterans and service members to just get over what they saw and experienced. So real quick, is moral injury the same as post-traumatic stress disorder? No, there are some similarities, and as you can see in the Venn diagram, you see like in the middle, like what symptoms overlap and what symptoms may not necessarily overlap. But also PTSD is something that can be clinically diagnosed, and there are certain criteria that one can meet. But moral injury is not something you will find in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it can be a bit more difficult to pin down and definitely say, hey, I have moral injury. And now I'm going to go into some examples. Just a quick content warning. This section has some distressing stories about wartime violence, including the deaths of children. I've tried not to be graphic. And there's also some, foul language. If you need to step away for a few minutes, I understand. Once again, the descriptions will be brief, and I've tried to avoid anything, graphic. So I'm only going to give 2 examples. And these examples shouldn't be viewed as saying, these are the only way military members and service and veterans can experience moral injury. They're just examples to make this concept a little bit more tangible. And the first example is from David Wood's 2016 book, What Have You Done? The Moral Injury of Our Longest Wars. So in example 1, Nicky Rudolph, during a firefight between Marines and the Taliban, saw from the corner of his eye someone shooting at him. Nick aims his weapon at the figure, realizing that it was a child about 12 or 13 years old. So Nick shoots and kills the child. After recounting that story, Nick says, he was just a kid, but I'm sorry. I'm trying not to get shot, and I don't want any of my brothers getting hurt. So when you are put in that kind of situation, it's shitty that you have to shoot him. You know it's wrong, but you have no choice. And when the author asks Nick if over time one heals from the moral injury of killing a child, Nick responds, no, it will always be there. So it's easy for those of us who weren't there to say, oh, well, I mean, Nick did what he had to do. The kid was shooting at him, so he shot back. It was a good kill. The 13-year-old was evil, and Nick was a good person during duty. However, this statement ignores the very real anguish that Nick experienced. In American society outside of war, killing kids is generally frowned upon. There are some exceptions, mainly having to do with white supremacy, in which Black and brown children are killed by law enforcement and their deaths are justified, but that's a different subject. And in general, American society views killing kids as morally wrong. But yet, here is Nick himself, only in his 20s, sent to war, where the enemies aren't just adults with weapons, but young children who themselves probably didn't choose to fight. And even if they did, I mean, the decision-making skills of 13-year-olds aren't exactly known for being the best. So example 2 is from Timothy Kudo, who in a 2013 opinion piece for the Washington Post mentions a firefight that he and his patrol got into 2010. So they ended up killing 2 people on motorcycles because the people on motorcycles ignored or didn't understand the command to stop. And based on the military's escalation of force guidelines at that time, they were permitted to shoot them. The Marines had thought, well, these people aren't stopping. They're here to attack us. We have to do what we have to do. But the 2 people killed ended up being civilians, and one looks to be about 16 years old. And Kudo mentions that years later, he still thinks about that situation every day. And in the article, he also discusses how he thinks about the decision he made to authorize airstrikes or for people under him to shoot. He still thinks about the people that died as a result of those decisions every day too. And he writes, war makes us killers. We must confront this horror directly if we're to be honest about the true cost of war. As I've mentioned before, these 2 examples aren't the only expressions of moral injury in veterans. They can get moral injury not only from personally killing or authorizing those under them to kill, but from witnessing people in their unit being killed or watching civilians being killed, by not being able to provide medical help to peers or civilians, by experiencing sexual assault and being betrayed, not only by the assaulter, but also by the chain of command and the larger institution. And even they can experience moral injury by changing their beliefs about the justice of the war being waged. And also moral injury doesn't necessarily need to be traced to, one single event. So I mentioned Reverend Dr. Yandell a lot because I went to school with him, and he's fantastic, and you should all look up his writing and academic research. He's a great person. But anyway, for Reverend Dr. Michael Yandell, his moral injury was the result of cumulative events and experiences that eroded his once near certainty about his own goodness and his ability to divide the world into good and evil. As a bomb technician, he was deactivating bombs on a daily basis, helping to save the lives of not only his fellow soldiers, but also civilians. He states, "Of course, that was the morally right action. I was one of the good guys, or so I thought." But as he thought more deeply about the war in Iraq, he began to ask questions about the larger nature of war. What comes to mind is not the fact that we removed dangerous devices and saved lives. It's the fact that almost all of these mutations and explosive materials were manufactured either in the Soviet Union or the United States, long before they were used as IEDs planted on the streets of Baghdad. Would they have been placed on the streets of Baghdad had the US military not been present? And then he often thinks about the Iraqi kids that would often plead for candy. Kids who sometimes got in the way of his mission and made him a bit annoyed. And he says, "Now I find myself asking what it means to have a child consistently witness that explosive force and destruction, even if the destruction is serving to remove dangerous devices from the streets." And I have one final section that I'm only going to go into briefly for two reasons. One, I'm still doing research on this aspect of moral energy, and two, my throat and my nose are starting to rebel against me. So I'm gonna have to deal with that after my talk for a second. So what does all this have to do with Christianity? So throughout Christian history, its response to war and violence has, if I'm being a bit charitable, been mixed, and I'm probably being a bit too charitable to Christianity. So during the first 4 centuries, Jesus' followers were essentially pacifist and rejected military service, but that changed around Constantine's time. And since then, Christianity has been used to endorse horrific acts of violence and to justify war. So even the just war theory has in practice not really been used to restrain war, but rather rulers, political and religious leaders have kind of used it to create a checklist to justify and endorse whatever war they wanted to engage in. And in the United States, Christianity and war are deeply entwined. The language used by politicians, religious leaders, and your average person to justify war often references Christian scriptures or symbols and ideas. So President George W. Bush often painted the war on terror as a battle between good and evil, and he used religious language to justify it. Those who are on our side, meaning who support American foreign policy and our wars are good. Those who don't are evil and can't be trusted. On the 1-year anniversary of 9/11, George Bush ended his speech by saying, "Ours is the cause of human dignity, freedom guided by conscience and guarded by peace. The idea of America is the hope of all mankind. That hope drew millions to this harbor. That hope still lights our way, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness will not overcome it." So the last verse directly references John chapter 1, verse 5. And in the biblical context, Jesus is the light that cannot be overcome. In Bush's context, the United States is the light that cannot be overcome. And President Joe Biden has also used this religious language, though perhaps not to the same extent that Bush did. So on August 26, 2021, President Joe Biden made a speech not only condemning the suicide attack on Kabul airport by ISIS-K, which killed 13 service members and many more Afghan civilians, but he also continued the long American tradition of ripping scripture from its literary and historical context in order to justify the continuation of war and violence. So in his speech, Biden quotes the 2,500-year-old book of Isaiah and conflates Isaiah's prophetic call with America's military objective. So, and I quote, "Those who have served through the ages have drawn inspiration from the book of Isaiah when the Lord says, 'Whom shall I send? Who shall go for us?' The American military has been answering for a long time. 'Here I am, Lord, send me. Here I am, send me.' Each of these women and men of our armed forces are the heirs of that tradition of sacrifice, of volunteering to go into harm's way, to risk everything, not for glory, not for profit, but to defend what we love and the people we love." And in popular culture, the conflation of military service and Christian faith is rampant, as you can see in these examples. I would like specifically to point to the one that says, "Only 2 defining forces have ever offered to die for you, Jesus Christ and the American soldier. One died for your soul, the other died for your freedom." So why does this matter? The idea that war, especially wars waged by the United States, are divinely ordained leads to the refusal to really interrogate the reasons for going to war. The notion that God calls Americans to fight in war also serves to downplay the massive amount of anguish, death, and destruction war causes. The idea that war is divinely ordained gives the majority of the American population and political leadership the excuse to support war without investigating whether war is the best option. It also gives the majority of the population the excuse to ignore the wars, as we saw throughout the last 20 years, where Afghanistan and Iraq and the other areas of conflict seem to only come up in the media every once in a while, and then people would kind of be like, oh, we're still at war? I forgot. So this contributes to the moral injury veterans and service members experience, because it not only leads to wars that directly create said moral injury, but the refusal to truly engage with the horrors of war contributes to the isolation and shame some veterans and military service members may feel about what they've experienced. So Michael Yandell references this shame while describing his experience visiting the National Mall in Washington, D.C. after a stint at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. He talks about feeling pride because he was part of the national story that the monuments tell, a national story about lofty ideals, heroism, and sacrifice. But he also felt shame. He writes, I stood there proud and I stood there ashamed. Shame because I knew the story told of victory through sacrifice leaves out many unattractive details. Shame because I knew there was a different story to tell, or at least a more complete story, and I was afraid to tell it. Shame, most of all, because I knew that what was expected of me in that place was to feel pride and gratitude. So, and yet, despite all the horrific ways that Christianity has been used to justify and glorify war, while downplaying the real harm it causes on the civilians caught in the crosshairs and on those fighting it, I do believe that some Christian ideas and symbolism can be used to help or prevent the anguish of moral injury. And one way is by advocating for the prevention of moral injury by advocating for the end of war. In conjunction with, the long history of war and violence, Christianity has always had a strain of nonviolence. There have always been denominations and individuals who have said, you know what, this is not the way we're going to do this. This is not what we believe the gospel says. We're going to hold our rulers to account for arguing for war. So an end to war and a culture obsessed with glorifying war can help eradicate a significant factor causing moral injury in veterans and service members. And churches and, generally communities of faith, doesn't have to be Christian, it could be anyone, any community of faith or any community actually, can provide avenues to build relationships where civilians and veterans and service members can have honest and difficult conversations of war. Obviously, this might not work in communities where war is glorified, but in other spaces, it can be encouraged. And at its best, communities of faith can provide spaces for deep listening. Not the superficial listening many of us do that's like, hey, okay, I'm only listening so I can find an opportunity to say what I can say. Please be quiet so I can talk. But the type of listening that says, I truly hear you. I may not understand what you're going through because it's not my experience, but I understand you. But I hear what you're saying. And this type of listening is without judgment and without making superficial statements meant to make the other person feel better, but in practice often shuts down conversation. So communities of faith can also grapple with difficult theological concepts such as, what does forgiveness look like in relation to war and moral injury? What does repentance look like? What does acts of service look like? So in practice, I think many of us know that this doesn't always happen in communities of faith, but I think the possibilities of deep conversation and mutual listening and accompanying veterans and service members in that journey is there. I have some final thoughts. So I focused on military moral injury, and though that term was coined specifically to deal with anguish that veterans and service members experience, that concept has kind of grown and has been expanded to include, first responders, or even the moral injury that Black and brown people experience living in a country marred by white supremacy. And then also one area of research that I haven't seen being explored, at least in English sources I have access to, is the moral injury of the civilians in the countries where we fight the war. I mean, if American service members experience moral injury, I can only imagine that the civilians of Iraq and Afghanistan and all the other places where we have, drones and things like that have experienced it as well. And I'm going to say something that might be controversial. I would wager to say that even the people we categorically describe as evil incarnate, such as members of the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or ISIS, might also struggle with moral injury as well. But I'm just going to drop it there, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, and I will be right back because I need to deal with my nose.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a few moments of silence and then we'll play a song.